We have solution B for the microphone. It should be okay now. Going old school with the lavalier mic. All right? And it'll be a little bit in and out compared to what you're used to, since the mic won't follow my mouth. It stays put, and my mouth is what moves around. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Open your Bibles. Proverbs chapter 10, please. Proverbs chapter 10. And I will ask you to pray with me as you find your place. Father, in the name of Jesus, we come to you, Lord, and we ask that you would speak to your people again through your word. We believe you, Lord, that your word is living and active and powerful. We trust in that. We depend on that. We rely, Lord, on the effectiveness of your word to sanctify us. We also, though, need just as much the power of your Holy Spirit working in us and through the word, Lord, so that the seed that is sown bears good fruit. And we ask for that help from you in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, last time we looked at Proverbs chapters 8 and 9 together. Chapter 8 promoted the excellence and the greatness of God's wisdom. Again, we saw once again how wisdom is made widely available to all, being described in chapter 8 as crying out and as lifting up her voice throughout all the places of the city and the streets where everybody lives. Wisdom, again, calling out, as it said, to all the sons of men, promising all who will listen to God's wisdom that they will only hear excellent things if they listen to God's wisdom. They will only hear right things, it said. Only truth you'll hear. Only words of righteousness you'll hear, it said. Never will you hear wickedness, it said. Never will you hear crooked things or perverse things if you're listening to God's wisdom. Again, wisdom, it said, is more valuable than the most valuable things of the earth, silver and gold mentioned, that nothing that one can desire can compare with wisdom. We also saw that wisdom not only calls out, but that wisdom promises to be responsive to those who heed the call and then seek after wisdom. Wisdom initiates the call, and wisdom promises to respond to your response, which is pretty convenient and gracious of our God. It said that those who seek wisdom diligently will find it. Chapter 8 also reinforced the presentation of wisdom as existing prior to creation. That wisdom, in fact, played some part in creation in some way, like chapter 3 had already said, and that God's wisdom enjoyed what had been created. We have that picture, in particular mankind, just as we know that in Genesis, how it says that God saw what he had made and enjoyed it. He said it was good on several occasions, and then at the end of Genesis 1, he said it was very good. Chapter 8 ended with the fatherly appeal to his children that they would listen to wisdom and therefore obtain favor from the Lord, rather than disdain wisdom. And in doing so, you would wrong your own soul, you're warned, of self-destruction, basically. And even at the very end of that chapter, there is an embracing of death that one is guilty of when they disdain God's wisdom or ignore it or turn away from it, rather than receive it and walk on the paths of life. In chapter 9, the personified description of wisdom continued to show that not only did wisdom call out widely to all, but also wisdom provides generously, very generously, for all who will answer her invitation. We had the picture of wisdom building her house and hewing out the pillars and preparing this great feast and all those kinds of things, and sending out the maidens to distribute the invitations so that any and all who wanted to could respond and could come in and enjoy all the blessings of this feast, or of wisdom's provision in that case. And in doing that, it is to forsake foolishness and live. That was followed by the warning to not be a scoffer or a wicked man in rejecting that invitation, that gracious generosity of God's wisdom. Instead, a wise person proves their wisdom, as we've seen many times in the opening chapters. A wise person proves that they are indeed wise in their response to wisdom itself, responding favorably, responding humbly, responding obediently to the wisdom of the Lord. Namely, that means the fear of the Lord. Chapter 9 closed with the contrasting picture then of a foolish woman. Again, wisdom has been personified as a woman. Foolishness also has been personified as a woman in this book. So the personification, the contrasting picture of a foolish woman who, like wisdom, also calls out far and wide, also makes promises of enjoyable things, but the comparison ends with the nature of her offers, which are very different, and the results of walking in her ways are also very different. So like we've been saying, that wisdom always warns of consequences, loves you enough to warn of consequences, focusing on doing what is right now and enjoying the benefits of righteousness now and long term, while different from that, foolishness minimizes or ignores consequences altogether, focusing only on the short-term pleasure and hiding the devastating consequences that ultimately are death and hell. Through the first 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs, we have seen that kind of contrast back and forth, and in many times painting these great pictures for us, whether it's wisdom personified or some other thing, or Solomon like a father saying, this is what I saw from my, from up on my balcony, I saw this young man, and so on and so forth. So we've seen these kinds of longer treatments of what wisdom looks like versus with what foolishness looks like. And so we've seen those contrasts in that kind of a format, righteousness and wickedness, and good and evil, and right and wrong, and like we've said, also life and death. Now we come to chapter 10, though, and it changes. With chapter 10, we're entering into a new section of this book. Instead of the previous longer descriptions and imagery and personifications and so on to paint a picture, we now get into verses that will, for the most part, follow the form of kind of contrasting couplets, if you want to call it that. And what I mean by that is that most verses that we have in the next several chapters, next 6 chapters or so, most of these verses are going to make short, general statements of quick contrasts that this is wise, but that is foolish. One who does this will see this, but one who does that will experience that. And it's going to have a lot of those kinds of things talking about A, but B. And that's going to be this kind of format that we're going to see for the most part, not all the time, but for the most part over these next chapters in this next section. Most of them are going to be prescriptive because of that. Some will still be descriptive, making just general statements about life and about people, but even within those, you have the implied prescription of what to do or what not to do. Compared to the format of the first 9 chapters, you can look at these and consider them to be like bite-sized Proverbs, just one per verse, one little good, not per verse, per verse. There's a space there, and that's important, especially in Proverbs. But these are that kind of thing. We've had these larger kind of a meal thing as this big picture is painted in the previous chapters, and now it's one, kind of quick hitting like that, real concise, real brief, real short. Some of them are tied together by topic, and so we'll see that as we go through the chapter tonight and as we go through the other chapters after that. So even though they are, and even sometimes the way Bibles are formatted, you see a small space between each single verse. And sometimes it looks like they should stand alone when they are actually, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 are talking about the same kind of thing. So they can stand alone, but as usual, they're better left in the context if there is some in the verse that leads up to it or the verse that follows it. So nonetheless, what we're going to see is, even though we have this new format, even though we have these kind of short cause and effect, sowing and reaping kind of statements, they still make the same overall point that Proverbs makes as a whole, which is that there is a wise way to go and there is a foolish way to go. And it is your call. We've seen that very plainly. There is free will on the part of the hearer on how they respond to God's wisdom. So again, that is consistent. Some of the verses, like I said, stand alone. Some will be by topic. We'll touch on that as we move through. So, let's begin tonight in Proverbs chapter 10 and in verse 1, where it says, the Proverbs of Solomon. A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is the grief of his mother. So, this section begins with a pretty straightforward piece of wisdom here. There's not a great need to kind of unpack that or dig around in the words or kind of see anything other than really what's on the surface. What's on the surface is the father of a wise son is a glad father. And the reason is because his son is wise. That he looks at the life of his son, that his son is walking in wisdom, walking in the path of life, that kind of thing. Obviously that makes sense. His son lives and walks with wisdom, and so the father is a glad father. Same thing is true on the flip side of that, though. The mother of a foolish son is a mother who grieves. And that also is right on the surface there. It's plain. She grieves. Why? Because her son disdains wisdom, has gone against what he has been taught. There basically is this kind of a person or this kind of a son chooses to self-destruct their own life. And certainly for the heart of a mother, that is a grievous thing to observe. This, of course, though, the way that this is stated here, of course, it does not mean that a mother doesn't also rejoice over a wise son. Of course she does. It also doesn't mean that a father doesn't also grieve over a foolish son. Of course he does. Later Proverbs are going to make that plain. It also doesn't mean that this applies only to sons and not to daughters. That, of course, is not true either. We remember that most of the Proverbs are written from a father writing to his son. We've seen that example. There have been several times where he says, my son specifically. A couple times where he says, my children, but several times he says, my son. And then, as we have seen from the content and the subject matter that he's discussed, especially in relation to the immoral woman that you need to watch out for, you again get the entire sense that this father is speaking to his son. And so again, we have this kind of thing as he's writing to a son, telling a son, if you will be a wise son, this will result. If you are a foolish son, this will result. Obviously, it applies across the board to sons and daughters alike. So that is what we have seen so far. We remember that most of the Proverbs are that way. And rather than a super technical interpretation of a proverb, the point that we have here is to take away the main point of wisdom and warning that it is intended to teach. We have here, though, a principle that just plainly says that parents of wise children are happy about it. Parents of foolish children grieve over it. Now that assumes something. Obviously, that assumes that the parents themselves are wise and that they are themselves accepting of the ways and of the will of the Lord in their own life. Otherwise, they wouldn't recognize wisdom or foolishness in the life of their kids, and nor might they probably even care. Certainly some of you, I expect, I have seen plenty of parents who seem to tragically entertain themselves by raising up their children in their own foolish ways. Sometimes they are even doing it deliberately. And I have seen parents who have thought that it was pretty cool or pretty funny to deliberately teach their kid to do something that they knew to be wrong. It's funny to hear a little kid curse, or it's funny to hear a little kid, do something, or watch what he does over there, and then we watch and we see him go and knock a kid over and take his thing, and it's like, ha, that's hilarious. That's not hilarious. So it's interesting to look at a proverb that clearly has a main point, but the assumption is that we're talking about parents who themselves are wise and not raising up children in their own foolishness and in their own wickedness, and sad to say there are plenty of those. There are plenty of parents also who basically accomplish the same thing by refusing to teach their children either way. Some teach them wrong deliberately. Some refuse to teach them either way about anything right or wrong. And they defend that by saying that they are the open-minded ones. They're empowering little Johnny to do whatever. They view themselves as being more progressive because they wouldn't put boundaries on their children. They give them no direction whatsoever. They implement no discipline in their life at all, and they do not implement any deliberate instruction into their lives either. And so, obviously, the parent who willfully teaches their children wrong or willfully teaches them nothing, that parent is not in mind here in this proverb whatsoever. That's a whole other proverb for them. This proverb assumes that the parent themselves is also wise, and the picture really would kind of point back to the one who wrote the proverb himself, Solomon. He himself knows the wise ways of God. He has been and is continuing to instruct, teaching his kids in the ways of the Lord. And so again, there's this picture where he is really talking about himself. You know, son, if you walk in the wise ways that I have instructed, there are a lot of benefits that come with it. He's already explained that. We're going to see them again. A lot of benefits. One of them is that you bless my heart. And if you walk in the way of a fool, as if there were no God, which is really what a fool is in the Scriptures, it means that someone who walks as if there's no God. If you walk that way, not only are there layers and layers of consequences in your life, but one of them is that you're killing your mother. You're breaking our hearts. And if there isn't any other way to get through to some kids, maybe that is a way that parents can try and elicit some sense of wisdom. That this is something that is bringing a great deal of pain to the parent. And many of you have parents, and many of you are parents, and you understand perhaps even both sides of that kind of thing, where you have seen your children or where you have yourselves either delighted your parents or grieved them, and where you yourself perhaps have been delighted or been grieved. So I don't think that many people are left out in being able to kind of relate to this, even in an intellectual sense. When we have walked through 9 chapters with Solomon, I think that we understand what it is that he's talking about and can say, I can see how that would grieve the heart of a parent. I can see how this other thing would delight the heart of a parent. So through wisdom, the parent understands what's at the end of the road for the person who walks down this road or walks down that road, and so they have taken it to heart to instruct their children, and that is because they love them. Remember that the basic definition, like I said, of a fool is one who lives as if there is no God at all. So any parent with even an inkling of wisdom would respond like verse 1 is talking about here. Now, like we will see in a lot of the Proverbs, we can easily find the principle represented in the New Testament as well. That shouldn't surprise us, I don't think. We do see this principle in the New Testament with the Apostle John. In 2 John 1, verse 4, he says, I rejoiced greatly that I have found some of your children walking in truth as we received commandment from the Lord. 3 John 1, 4, same idea. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. He is speaking in spiritual terms, spiritual children and that kind of thing who've heard the gospel from his ministry and who are walking in truth according to the word of the gospel. But the principle is the same. He hears that they are walking in the wisdom of the ways of God, and he says, I could not hear better news. There is nothing I would rather hear than that. And so that certainly is a principle that matches up with Proverbs 10:1 here. And the point again is the same. Not only does living by God's wisdom benefit you, but those around you, specifically parents, rejoice over that. Verse 2 and verse 3. Treasures of wickedness profit nothing, but righteousness delivers from death. The Lord will not allow the righteous soul to famish, but he casts away the desire of the wicked. So there in verse 2, we get a description of wickedness that reminds us of how wisdom has been described many times already. And that's with the word treasures. Wisdom has been described as a graceful ornament a couple times. Wisdom has been described as royal chains. Wisdom has also been described as being better than silver and gold. And we've already seen in using those pictures, therefore, we get what great gain there is with wisdom. And so then to make a contrasting point here, we're warned that treasures of wickedness profit nothing. And yet again, we have the gain on the other side, that righteousness, though, delivers from death. And so the point is that it is the soul that is most important, that it is the spiritual over the physical. Because in this world, like we have talked about before, we talked about it last time, there can be gain and advantage and pleasure found in treasures of wickedness. But Paul warns us that sowing to the flesh reaps corruption. And so here we see that while one can certainly accumulate great earthly treasures by ways of wickedness or deceit or cheating or extortion or greed or lying or stealing, it ultimately, though, spiritually speaking, it profits exactly nothing. Even though it may profit a great deal in an earthly sense. Their bank account may be bigger than all of ours put together, and they may have great influence and great power and enjoy great comforts and do all kinds of stuff in this world. And so there are quote-unquote treasures of wickedness. But that is not the kind of treasure that's going to count for you ever. It says, especially spiritually speaking, it profits you zero. Why? Well, we're given a hint as to why in the words that are after that. Because it doesn't deliver you from that which cannot be avoided, no matter how rich you are, and that is death. You cannot avoid that. You can have all kinds of resources and influence and power, and you will still die. Ecclesiastes 7 tells us that death is the end of all men. Every single person will come to that point one day. It is appointed unto all men to die once, Hebrews 9 tells us, and then the judgment. And as we see here, only righteousness delivers from death, not riches, not treasures of wickedness or anything of this world. It is only righteousness that delivers from death. Does that mean that righteousness delivers from physical death? Of course not. Spiritual death is what is being brought to mind here, the death of the soul in that sense. That, of course, though, does not mean that the soul of the wicked ceases to exist after the body dies. The soul doesn't die like the body does. The body ceases and starts to actually go away. The soul does not cease. And so what we're talking about here is death in that spiritual sense, meaning separation from God, from the one who made you, from the one who did everything he could to save and reunite you and him. And so that's what's in view here. And of course, the gospel message has always taught these things. It's always taught that our own righteousness is like filthy rags to the Lord, that there's none righteous, that there's not one righteous. And the solution, of course, is Christ's righteousness, imputed to us by faith in him because of God's grace. And so it is not self-righteousness that delivers from death, but what God gives. Then, like this verse says, we're delivered from death and will actually spend eternity with the Lord, as opposed to, who else is described here, those who rejected that gift of salvation and will experience certainly physical death, but worse, spiritual death. We find that this principle is also found in the New Testament, and it is taught by Jesus. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus said, "For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul?" He makes the point, and it gives that explanation in that follow-up question. Because you can't use that where you're going. It profits you nothing, just like the wisdom of the Proverbs says here, treasures of wickedness, even all the treasures of wickedness of the world that you could accumulate, profit nothing for that which counts most. It's righteousness from Christ that delivers the soul from death. Related to that, verse 3, we already read it. It said that the righteous soul will not famish or will not suffer hunger, while the wicked will suffer their desires going unmet, unsatisfied, unfed. And it is the Lord who will see to those results for each group, it said. The wicked, of course, by definition, they believe that because of their treasures of the world or just because of their pride, they believe that they have provided for their own needs already, that they get credit for that, and that they will absolutely get their desires met as well, on their own, apart from God's grace and mercy. They are the man in Jesus' parable who goes into the wedding feast but refuses to wear the required wedding garment. And then, of course, that person gets thrown out. Whereas the righteous are depending on the Lord to save and to sustain and to provide, and physically, sure, but spiritually more so. We again find this in the New Testament from Jesus. Matthew 11, Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And that matches up with what we find here again. The soul of the righteous will never famish. Instead, the soul of the righteous receives rest, satisfaction, all that you need. All that the wicked desire will be cast away from them. That which they were expecting that their wants would be met, and they will never be able to get their hands on it. Once again, with these verses, we see that wisdom does not hold back on describing the reality of how one's response to the Lord results in something, either satisfaction or destruction. In verses 4 and 5, we continue. It says, "He who has a slack hand becomes poor, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. He who gathers in summer is a wise son. He who sleeps in harvest is a son who causes shame." Now, in these verses, we come to the first time in this section where we have a presentation of a topic other than general wickedness and foolishness versus general righteousness and wisdom. And so here we have an actual pattern of activity identified, and it is laziness now that is being warned against, and it is diligence now that is being prescribed instead. So the slack or the lazy hand or person becomes poor, it says. Does that mean that all poverty is the result of laziness? No, it doesn't. But you can expect to find yourself in need, though, if you insist on being lazy, if you insist on being slack, if you refuse to work. Diligence, or working hard, is matched here with wisdom in verse 5 with this picture of a son who gathers in summer. Are there things a son might rather do in summer than go out and gather stuff in the fields? Certainly. But during harvest time, what is it that needs to take priority? The harvest. That's what needs to take priority. It's not playtime, it's not free time, it's not leisure time, it's not vacation, it's not see your friends, it's not go do any of those things. Even things that might be noble things have to be set aside and given second place right now, because right now is harvest time. And so that has to be priority number one. Wisdom, here it says, wisdom gathers or works hard when it is time to gather or work hard. Wisdom refuses to sleep during harvest. Why not sleep and maybe just get to it later? Well, simply put, it is because, by definition, harvest time doesn't last forever. Harvest time is something that you work for and then wait for, and then it comes, and then it's here, and you are to be diligent about your time when harvest is now ripe, and there is also coming a time when harvest will be over. And that is an important thing to remember. There comes a time when the opportunity to harvest or work has come to an end. And you are at that time, we are at that time locked in with the results or the fruit of either our diligence or our laziness. Who remembers the famous question from that show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Do you remember that? What's the most famous question that comes from that show? Is that your final answer? You remember that? Is that your final answer? Remember on the show, the scenario is that a question is asked and there's answers to choose from, and the person kind of gets to talk it out. They get to kind of answer out loud and talk it through, and it's not this, and I don't think it's that. It's probably one of these two, and whoever the host is, I think I'm going to go with green chairs. And the host is like, green chairs and this and that, and kind of talks it through with them a little bit and says, okay, is that your final answer? Yes, that's my final answer, green chairs. Well, that is being locked in. You now are going to get the fruits of, you had time, right? You had time to talk it through and do some stuff and figure it out and call your lifeline and do any of that stuff, right? You had time to come up with your final answer. And then time is up, you now have to give it, and you are locked. Well, that's the same idea as what we have here with this harvest time. It has come, right? The question has been asked, or harvest has come. And now you have time. You have time now to respond to this which has been laid in front of you, because it's harvest time. But that time is going to come to a close. Your time to answer the question is going to come to a close. Your time to respond to the harvest that's been provided is also going to come to a close. And your final answer is going to come at the end of harvest time with what you did, with what we do when it's harvest time or when it's time to work. And then you are locked in with basically your answer to the offer of harvest time. Whether you worked or whether you slept. Now, not only is there the physical consequences in that entire scenario of how much food you now have or don't have, but verse 5 said, again regarding a son, that the lazy son causes shame. So that again reminds us that there's not only the potentially devastating physical consequence of now you don't have food and you can want to go pick stuff all you want now. It doesn't matter. Harvest is over and it's wintertime. So you now have what you have. Well, the lazy son not only is going to be out of food, but it says here that the lazy son causes shame. He was expected to and was being depended upon to go work when it was time to work. And in doing so, he would have needed to put the needs of others, namely the family in this case, above his own desires to go do other summertime stuff. He had the opportunity to work during harvest, but he did not take advantage of it, and now the family is in need. That's why the lazy son in that case causes shame. He causes hunger, and he causes shame. Once again, the main lesson here, is that the ramifications of one's decisions affect other people as well. And that easily is the picture that we have there, not only for the very clear physical implications, because that's true, but there are general implications as well. There will be, including in this instance, there will be no one else to blame but oneself. Harvest came and went. What did you do? Now that is simple enough, I think, for us to understand in a physical sense. But I want us to also think about a spiritual application of what wisdom looks like during harvest time. Jesus talked about this. He told his disciples that the harvest truly is great, plentiful, but the laborers are few, he said. Therefore, he says, your right response to that is to pray. Pray that the Lord of the harvest, that he would send out laborers into his harvest. And do you know the very next thing that Jesus did after that? He sent them out into the harvest. And I think that is rather like it's super simple, but pretty fascinating. Okay, here's the situation. The harvest is plentiful. It's a great harvest. The harvest is not the problem. The abundance of the harvest is not the issue. The opportunity is not the problem. There's no obstacle there. There is tremendous opportunity. The issue is that the laborers are few. And so therefore, you need to ask God that he would solve this problem and raise up laborers to go into this plentiful harvest and do something about it. Bring the harvest in. And so apparently the answer to that prayer is you, right? He tells the disciples, you pray. And then the very next words are, and so he sent them out. And so off they go. They're the answer. So we are, as servants of the Lord, recognizing that the harvest is absolutely plentiful and great. And that's always the case until it's done. Until harvest time is over. After harvest time is done, then that's it. But the harvest is still plentiful. That wasn't some first century situation where he looked at a particular area. The harvest, generally speaking, in the world is plentiful. The laborers still are few. The opportunity still is there. The response is the same. You need to pray, not just in general. You need to pray and ask God that he would send laborers. And then you probably ought to get your bag ready and get your sandals on and gird up, because you could very well find yourself as the answer to that prayer. And in some way, you will be the answer to that prayer. And I will be the answer to that prayer. There is not one individual in here who is not in contact in some way with some piece of the plentiful harvest. Every single one of us is in contact with the waiting, abundant harvest. So, we need to pray, and we need to be ready, so that when he gives us that opportunity and you find yourself in the middle of the field / conversation or situation or opportunity, that you recognize the harvest is plentiful. I ask God about laborers, and here I am. So it's important to see what it is that Jesus did. The solution is you pray, and then the solution is Jesus sends. Just like it says in verse 5, he who gathers in summer is wise. But he who sleeps in harvest, though, again, carry this through with the spiritual application. He who sleeps, instead of going out, he who sleeps instead of doing what Jesus called him to do, he who sleeps in harvest is a son who causes shame. All right, if there's spiritual implication on the first part, then we have to be willing to look at the spiritual implication on the second part. Certainly we want to be the wise son who goes out and does the will of the Father and tends that field and brings in the harvest as much as we can put our hands on. But there is also a great danger, though, if we don't do that, if we sleep instead, figuratively speaking, then we bring shame, and we certainly don't want to do that. Throughout the New Testament, we are warned to not be figuratively sleeping at the wrong time, and in doing that, might we miss what we are supposed to be doing, or supposed to be seeing, at least noticing, acknowledging, oftentimes though it's supposed to be doing. Jesus told Peter, James, and John in the Garden of Gethsemane, he said, why do you sleep? Physically speaking, why do you sleep? He said, in doing that, you're bringing trouble on yourself. Instead of sleeping, he says, rise up and pray, lest you enter into temptation. There is that difference. If you sleep at the wrong time when you should be doing some other more productive things, spiritually speaking, if you sleep instead, trouble is coming and you will not be ready. Or you can not be sleeping and instead rise up and, just like in the prior example, pray and see how it is that God might make you ready for that which comes, so that you respond favorably in a godly way, in the Spirit, productive, fruitful, rather than enter into temptation, which was the warning. In Romans 13, Paul is telling them that loving one another is the fulfillment of every law in the law that's related to interpersonal behavior. He says that all of them put together, just like we have with the way that Jesus explains it, all of that put together is summarized and encompassed and encapsulated in the one command, love one another. All the different ways that you can love your neighbor, all the ways that you don't covet their stuff and don't commit adultery with their wife, and all those things that you go, well, yeah, don't steal, okay? Well, all of that is all under the heading of love one another, okay? So in saying that, he then says this, listen, and do this, meaning love one another, knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep. For now our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Therefore, let us cast off the works of darkness and let us put on the armor of light. Let us walk properly as in the day, not in revelry and drunkenness, not in lewdness and lust, not in strife and envy. So what is he saying there? He is painting a picture there of very different scenario of what awake looks like and what asleep looks like. And he is in that sense saying if you're sleeping at the wrong time, that he's drawing a picture of you're engaged in willful sin. Now, when instead of being that kind, you should be fruitful over here, being about the harvest, and instead of working in the harvest field, you're sleeping. And in that sense, sleep looks ugly, because it's not just sleep. It's not just not working. It's in fact working against oftentimes in some way, especially if you preach the gospel with your mouth and you defy the gospel with your life. And so that's the picture here. He says, hey, being awake in this sense at this time, know the time, he says. Know what's going on and how much time you have left and what's going on. The time is what? It's harvest time. Know that time. And in knowing it, in acknowledging what time it is, you need to cast off the works of darkness, not walk in lewdness and lust, not walk in drunkenness and revelry. Not anymore. You were once that, as he's going to say in Ephesians 5. You were once darkness, but now you are children of light. Therefore, walk as children of light. Again, it's the same picture, light and awake as opposed to darkness and sleep. And so Ephesians 5 is where he says, you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. He says, all things that are exposed are made manifest by the light, for whatever makes manifest is light. Therefore, he says, quoting the Old Testament, awake you who sleep, arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. He says, see then, therefore, that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And don't be drunk with wine, in which is dissipation. Instead of that, be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, and singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord, and giving thanks always for all things to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus, and submitting to one another in the fear of the Lord. He gives us that same general picture. Awake and working and knowing the time looks like living this life that's not marked by dissipation, by drunkenness, by foolishness, and so on, but instead walking as a child of the light. So that, again, there is a tremendous amount of the Christian lifestyle, living a life of holiness that pleases the Lord, that is a part of recognizing what time it is so that we can be a fruitful part of harvesting, because that is the time. Paul, again, 1 Thessalonians 5, he says, you are all sons of light and sons of the day. We are not of the night nor of darkness. Therefore, let us not sleep as others do, but let us, instead of sleeping, let us watch and be sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk are drunk at night. But let us, who are of the day, be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet, putting on the hope of salvation. Once again, the same thing, talking about you need to live your life in the light of the Lord, and that is a great degree of how it is that we are a productive part of the harvest itself. So again, that is the time that it is. It is harvest time. And we are told all the way back now to Proverbs 10, you have this picture. Again, it's the physical sense is what's on the surface there, but there's a tremendous spiritual lesson for us that instead of sleeping when it's time to work, and sleeping takes these couple different forms. One is just to not work. The other is to actually live in such a way that runs counter to the gospel. Both of those are considered to be asleep or walking in darkness, and we're told that is to be completely put aside. There is, in the very best sense, it would be there's time for pleasure later. And trust me, that's going to be far better than the self-seeking kind that you might think is better now instead of working in the harvest. So all that, again, set that stuff aside. Now is the time. The verse is here again against the lazy man sleeping during harvest, who he obviously won't have food. That's an easy thing to see. But there's a spiritual lesson from this as well, that we should guard ourselves against sleeping now in any of those kinds of ways that we just saw. No sleeping. Instead, let's be diligent, wise about the times that we're in, so that God might help us to be fruitful, since He's assigned us to go out there and be that anyway. All right, let's look at verse 6 and 7. Blessings are on the head of the righteous, but violence covers the mouth of the wicked. The memory of the righteous is blessed, but the name of the wicked will rot. These verses here take a look at both the present and the future of the righteous and the wicked. The righteous are blessed. They're given blessings, of course. That's from the Lord. While the wicked receive violence against themselves, really, as we have seen, they do violence to themselves in having been unrepentant enemies of the Lord. Then, that's kind of the present picture. Then looking forward, in a sense of after the righteous or the wicked has lived their life and died, we now get that verse 7 points to their legacy, how they are remembered. The memory of the righteous is blessed, but the name of the wicked will rot. It will decay. And specifically, that word is describing something that's worm-eaten. So that is a parallel being drawn here from what happens to the dead body physically. That is what happens to the name or the legacy or the remembrance of the wicked. Not only does their body rot, their name rots. Their name decays over time. In Ecclesiastes 8, verse 10, Solomon says, "Then I saw the wicked buried, who had come and gone from the place of holiness, and they were forgotten in the city where they had so done. This also is vanity." It's just an absolute complete waste. What an empty life that amounted to literally nothing except for a bad name that goes on after the bad life. So there is that warning of the rot that one's name will experience, or their legacy will, if they are among the wicked. It is not hard, I think, for us to see so many people of the world today pushing and pulling and wheeling and dealing in their attempts to make a name for themselves. Sometimes they even put it on their buildings. But here, they are warned that the way to be remembered well is to be righteous and wise before the Lord. Not in their own ways, but in the ways of God. The way to have your name rot, on the other hand, is to chase the world and to be wicked and godless. And there are many who could take this to heart and would be wise to repent and no longer be storing up wrath for themselves and good reasons for their name to rot in the memory of the people who come behind them. A good example of both sides of this is found in Mark 14. That is where we have the woman with the alabaster flask. And in the flask is this very expensive oil of spikenard. And Jesus is there in the house at a meal. And she comes and she breaks the bottle. She doesn't open it. She has to break it, literally break it, which means you got to use it all now. She pours out this very expensive oil out on Jesus' head. She anoints Jesus with her very expensive oil. Now that's a well-known passage, and that's my point. I want you to listen to what happened. There were some who were indignant among themselves and said, "Why was this fragrant oil wasted? For it might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they criticized her sharply. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She's done a good work for me, for you have the poor with you always, and whenever you wish you may do them good. But me you do not have always. She has done what she could. She has come beforehand to anoint my body for burial. Assuredly I say to you, listen, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her." She's the example of that first part, right? The memory of the righteous is blessed. And Jesus himself highlights this woman's gift and says, this will be told, this will be a piece of the gospel message wherever it is told as a memorial to her. If you're there, you see the next couple verses and you see why the next example is, "But the name of the wicked will rot." Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And so he sought how he might conveniently betray him. Is there an individual whose name has rotted more than Judas Iscariot? Who is known more than Judas for being a scoundrel and a betrayer and one who stabs his friends in the back? And every time there is an example of that, Judas is taken as the label for that. He is a Judas, right? It's a byword now. It's a word that's used to hiss at someone. And in that example, right in Mark 14, we have the entire play out of this proverb. The memory of the righteous will be blessed. There's the woman. But the memory or the name of the wicked will rot. And that is exactly Judas Iscariot. As he goes then to betray Jesus, take it for money, and every category that's like that, doing something bad for money, betraying friends, all that stuff just fits under Judas. Fits under Judas Iscariot. And that's an example of that. In verse 8, back in Proverbs 10, it says, "The wise in heart will receive commands, but the prating fool will fall." That first part, of course, is an encapsulation of one of the main themes we've already seen in the first 9 chapters. That is the proof of one's wisdom with what they do with wisdom. When God speaks, when the Word of God speaks, when the Spirit testifies to the truth, then the person proves himself to be wise by receiving that command rather than ignoring it, pushing it away, justifying, not doing it, making excuses, that kind of thing. So the wise response proves the wisdom of the person, that they do what with the commands? They receive them. They don't act like they didn't get them or that they don't understand. They just receive the commands of God for what they are. Whereas the prating fool will fall. Prating, specifically the Hebrew word there, it means lips, it means speech. And so we have the kind of the introduction to one of the main themes of Proverbs, and one of the main themes of this chapter is your mouth, our words, and what they can lead to. Okay? So here we have the prating fool, prating meaning speech, and so this is the fool who speaks forth his righteousness, or his foolishness, does not guard his mouth. He does not even see the need to. And a good parallel verse for this, even within Proverbs, is actually later in chapter 18. It says, "A fool's lips enter into contention, and his mouth calls for blows." He demands to get punched in the face. That's what the fool does, by his prating, by his continual talking, foolish words. A fool's mouth is his destruction, it says, and his lips are the snare of his soul. So, some people have their own self-destruct button, and it is their mouth. Other people's, it's other things by the way that they live in foolish ways. There are some who it is just their mouth is their verbal self-destruct button, that in this case you can see it leads to their downfall. It says he will fall. And so a mouthy fool will cause themselves, remember this is something that's done to himself, will cause themselves to fall. Now, in English here it says that this person will fall, and that doesn't sound anywhere near as violent as what the Hebrew says. It means to be overthrown. It means that one is taken and thrown down or cast aside. It's something that is forceful. It's not the picture of someone falling like we think that he'll fall and like he just kind of tips over and falls over. We think of that as fall. But this is not. This is far more forceful, far more violent. What you have brought on yourself is that you're taken by force and thrown down. And that's what the mouthy fool brings upon himself. Destructive force against himself to his own peril, instead of, first part, just receiving the commands wisely. You'd avoid a lot of that stuff. Verse 9. He who walks with integrity walks securely, but he who perverts his ways will become known. He who winks with the eye causes trouble, but a prating fool, there it is again, a prating fool will fall. Here we have the same graphic warning of self-destruction there at the end. But here the picture is of a wicked person The back half of verse 9 and the front half of verse 10 is the picture of a wicked person who has tried to keep their evil ways hidden, tried to keep their evil ways secret. You want a picture of that? You can remember what we saw before, the immoral woman who went out as it was getting dark and who assured the young man through all her flattery, what did she assure him? Would never happen. Never going to get found out. It's just, it's our beautiful little secret. Just you and me. But Jesus said, nothing is secret that will not be revealed, nor anything hidden that will not be known and come to light. But she didn't recognize that. So the warning here is for any who think that they're getting away with their secret evil plans. He who, in verse 9, perverts his ways will become known. That is the warning. You, he, they who pervert their ways will become known. Now, within that, there's two messages, right? One's for the perverter, and one's for the rest of us who are looking at that going, why does it seem like they just get away with stuff? Why? Why does that continue? And there are plenty of godly people who've gone before us where it's recorded in the Scriptures where they ask that of God with some emotion. What is going on, Lord? Why does this continue to happen? And it's verses like this that give us comfort. He who perverts his ways will become known. Even if it is at the very end and before the judgment, and all that stuff is going to come out. And it will. And perhaps someday before then it might. But it certainly will then. And we can rest assured that God settles all of these accounts. He who perverts his ways will become known as opposed to staying secret forever. And similarly, he who winks with the eye causes trouble. Now that picture is also of one who's up to something. But they're not broadcasting it. They've got signals and signs. And that's the picture. The winking of the eye. Later on, there's the shuffling of the feet and the pointing with the finger and just kind of this subtle stuff going on. There's little signals, little signs. We're not overt in trying to ensnare the person coming along here or into some scenario or some situation. It's not overt. We're not waving a black flag with a skull on it that says, come over here. That's not what we're doing. Instead, we're just winking. We just got something going on. And it is remaining hidden to that person who is supposed to be the target or the prey. Who is it not hidden before? The Lord. And so this is the wisdom of God who is reminding us of these things. Again, both of these pictures here, the perverted way will become known. He who winks with his eye, again, trying to keep things deceptive and devious, take evil advantage of the person who doesn't notice what's going on. Okay? They think they've gained something, those people. But instead, as it says there in verse 10, they've actually caused trouble, and that trouble is for themselves. Whereas, beginning of verse 9, he who walks with integrity walks securely. There's safety there. There's security in walking in the wise ways of the Lord. Verse 11, the mouth of the righteous is a well of life, but violence covers the mouth of the wicked. In fact, I tell you what, let's stop right here, and we'll pick this up, and we'll do kind of the back part of chapter 10 next time. David, you can go ahead and turn it off. We're a few minutes past time, and I don't want to try and mash in the rest of chapter 10. What I do